This exemplar provides some starting points for how Southern African cultures have learned to live in an area of high climate variability, where there are unpredictable seasonal climatic conditions in the Southern African region. Of course, north of the Zambezi, this is not the case, and the seasonal cycles of the region north of the Zambezi were governed by the predictable seasonal movement of the intertropical convergence zone in the summer. The convergence brings rain that moves north and south between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. The early agroecological cultures of this region had learned to read the seasonal change by tracking seasonal movement of the sun that brought the summer season rains. Alongside this, other signs like the arrival of migratory birds, new growth in the warm days, the buildup of clouds enabled people to coordinate the planting of crops with the arrival of the summer rains. South of the Zambezi, however, seasonal rainfall was a lot harder to predict at the nexus of three climatic systems and the influence of the El Nino-La Nina oscillation in the southern Pacific, which produced variations over years. This brought cycles of high climatic variation that are difficult to predict, even with the climate science that we have today. So, if you're starting to want to develop around climate concerns, a good starting point is to go right back to the stone-walled settlements. And Chigwedere describes how the cultures of the early Kalanga, as masters of water, and the later Ziwa, are both reflected in early agricultural settlements in the area. We now know that these were African settlements with ceremonies to interpret both the cycles of the sun and the moon so as to predict the arrival of the summer rains for cropping. The Sustainable Development Goals concern can be brought in here around climate change, and you can begin to develop a module around what we know, well, how are things today, what does this mean to us today, and what can we do about it by tuning in. And if we tune in, well, predicting summer rainfall was not easy in an area of high climate variability, and cycles of drought were more severe and the seasons more variable south of the Zambezi. Seasonal change could be accompanied by famine, cholera, and civic disturbances. Climate variability, famine, cholera, and civic disturbances could account for a return to the village settlements and the shifting agriculture in the region from the stone settlements after the dynastic periods of stone towns and more sedentary agriculture. So the area does reflect a lot of disturbance, and finding out how things are today out of this climate disturbances in the past could allow us to develop inquiries into how are climate variability and extreme events starting to affect cities in southern Africa, like the floods and extreme events that we've had. Then working out what can be done to mitigate climate variability, to reduce risk of famine and disease in the future. And then looking at local actions, what can be done to reduce risk associated with climate change. So there's not a lot around about these early cultural adaptations to climate extremes, but it's an area that is worth exploring, and later on in these modules we open up other evidence of this in the region as a foundation for realizing that climate variability is the most important factor that we need to take into account when addressing climate change, and that there's a rich history of how people successfully worked around these challenges in the past. And there's a lot of evidence now that we're able to take into account for planning future sustainability and social justice through the teaching that we do.